From Cherry Hill Publishing, The Raven Mocker, by Aiden James. Read by Timothy McKean. Evil returns to Cades Cove. Chapter 1. A sudden gust carried snow flurries into the anthropology department's long corridor before the main entrance closed, the security latch locking. The entire building sat deserted, as did much of the University of Tennessee's Knoxville campus. Most everyone, the faculty included, had left earlier that afternoon for winter break. Everyone, that is, except Eddie Krantz and his fiancée, Cynthia Towner. "We'll be in here 15 to 20 minutes tops," said Eddie, removing his scarf and brushing a thin layer of snowflakes from his coat. Blond and handsome, with serene blue eyes, he cracked a tense smile in hopes she would remain patient. Anxious to begin their trip to Miami Beach, it was imperative he completed the last-minute task given by Dr. Walter Pollock. A first-year archaeology intern, he could ill afford displeasing the professor. Let the boss down just once, and kiss any chance of better projects goodbye. "What does he want you to do again?" she asked impatiently. Cynthia removed her knitted cap and earmuffs. Her long dark brown hair no longer confined. It smartly framed her delicate features and emerald eyes within a soft oval face. She followed him to the second floor, to a small lab at the end of the dimly lit hall. The echoed clicks from their shoes accentuated the building's emptiness. "He needs me to double-check the tag numbers against the journal entries on some bones we removed from Cades Cove last month," he replied, unlocking the lab's door with a security card. He pushed the door open and flicked on the overhead fluorescent light, allowing her to enter before closing the door. Spartanly furnished, the small room contained 2 tables and a stool, along with a small wooden cabinet and stainless steel sink. On the table closest to the sink lay what looked like a complete human skeleton. The aged bones, darker than one might normally expect to find, were covered with unusual grooves, and the hands and feet were grotesquely elongated in comparison to the rest of the skeleton. The overall massive size was unusual. The lower legs and feet lined up in neat rows next to the rest of the skeleton, indicating whoever the bones belonged to had stood much taller than the 6.5-foot table. "Wow, so this is what you were talking about last month? After your team finished that dig, right?" Unlike some females he dated, Cynthia seemed intrigued by the remains, especially the apparent deformities. It was one of the things that endeared her to him. Nearly finished with her undergraduate studies in microbiology, she currently planned to attend med school within the next 3 years. It depended on when he finished his graduate work. He nodded, watching her fascination, and pleased the ticking timer for him to hurry had been paused. He needed to take care of Dr. Pollock's directive quickly. He moved to the cabinet and opened it. The professor's journal sat on the top shelf. Eddie grabbed the journal and returned to the table, opening to the ledger pages for this particular specimen. The only skeleton left to confirm, 24 others had already been verified and taken elsewhere for safekeeping. Like them, this one would be moved to a cold storage unit set up in the basement of an abandoned dormitory near the McClung Museum. Eddie had been charged with verifying the bones, carefully wrapping the skeleton, and then placing it inside a steel travel case waiting beneath the table. Another of the professor's assistants would pick it up later and take it to the storage unit. He set out to complete the assignment in earnest, while Cynthia continued to study the remains. She frowned. What did these belong to? She pointed to a pile of sharp, jagged teeth located near the bottom edge of the table. More than a dozen in total, each tooth curved slightly along its 2 to 3 inch length. "Some animal sin," he replied tersely. He barely looked up from the ledger. When he felt the heat from her glare, he looked up again, offering an apologetic smile. "Our preliminary findings were the teeth belonged to some kind of big cat that's no longer around here." "You mean extinct? That would make it prehistoric, right?" she persisted. Her gaze followed the skeleton's length, settling on the skull. "It's got a head bigger than Shaq's." She shot him a wry smile. He responded with another pithy glance. "Do you remember anything else I told you, before the Indian activists closed the site?" he asked, not immediately catching her allusion to the former star basketball player. He regretted the smugness slipped through unchecked, but hoping she'd let him finish the task uninterrupted. He tried to ignore the sting on her face from his latest barb. Her lower lip quivered, like in sullen anger. Well, there's something not so endearing. Jesus, she'd better learn not to be so damned sensitive. Otherwise she's never going to amount to anything in the medical field. "This is the most unusual specimen recovered from the dig," Eddie continued. "Dr. Pollock's really excited about the skull, since the cranial capacity is bigger than modern man, even rivaling the Cro-Magnon. Remember now?" She nodded weakly and looked at the bones. The skull's lower jaw curved to a point, a very unusual feature for any human. The entire skull lacked teeth, except for several worn molars. The sockets where the incisors and canines should have been were empty. "Where are its teeth?" Her sarcastic tone needled him. He looked up sharply from the ledger. Did she really need to go there? "Well," he began, frowning as he watched her gaze shift from the animal teeth to the skull and jawbone. "We might have lost them when we separated the skeleton from the girl's remains I also told you about." The look on his face wasn't so apologetic, imploring her silently to please let him finish the rest of his verification undisturbed. After all, he lacked half a page, and then it was on to packing up the bones and getting the hell out of this place. "Are you talking about the murdered girl from the early 1900s, whose remains were reburied right after Thanksgiving?" He confirmed with a nod. "Did you ever read the story about that?" She waited for his response, which was simply a negative headshake. "It was in both the Knoxville and school papers, as well as news on TV," she said. "The girl's remains were reburied in one of the churchyards in Cades Cove, and the service was a Scottish Native American ceremony." She didn't go on when his only response was a tepid grunt. To get his attention, she picked up a handful of the animal teeth. When he still ignored her, she moved to the skull and placed the teeth inside several of the empty sockets. A slight gasp escaped her mouth when all but one fit perfectly, and the other was just slightly loose. She was adding one of the longer teeth to a matching socket when he noticed what she was doing. "Stop that!" She withdrew her hand, wounded by his rebuke. He glared at her for a moment and seemed poised to say something else. Instead, he turned his attention to the skull, prepared to carefully remove the sharp canines from the skull's mouth. He hesitated, pulling his hand back. "My God, that's creepy." "This is really going to be bad if you jam them in there," he told her, determined to find a distraction from thinking about how the teeth looked so natural in the skull. For some crazy reason, the teeth made the thing look alive, as if his hand ventured too close, he might lose a finger or two. Dr. Pollock told us last week advanced carbon dating has proved this skeleton is the oldest human remains ever found in North America. He'll have my ass in a sling if I can't get the teeth out. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to mess anything up." This time, she did look like she'd cry. He wondered if the thing creeped her out, too. "It's okay, Sin," he reassured her, forcing himself to sound compassionate, while he gently removed the first tooth. The thing looked less sinister, and he moved on to the rest of the teeth. "Just give me a few more minutes. I'll hurry to get everything finished." Cynthia moved to the lone stool in the room, pulling it to the door while she waited. She tapped her feet lightly to let him know the timer was back on. Full on. Aside from her unusual patience, he wondered if perhaps she shared his mental picture of what the skull might look like if all the curved, sharp teeth were in place. Given its gangly height and other apparent deformities, the skeleton seemed alien despite its human characteristics. It was definitely predatory. Thank God it's dead. "Okay, that should do it," he proudly announced a few minutes later. Eddie removed the protective case from beneath the table and carefully placed the bones inside. He closed the case, sliding the journal into a sealed sleeve along the steel container's side. Only the teeth remained, to be catalogued and removed the following day by another assistant. After he locked the case, he turned his attention to her. The fact she didn't reciprocate his radiant smile wasn't an immediate cause for concern, since he had a 15-hour car ride to work on fixing that. But it was obvious that neither he nor she wanted to hang out in the lab any longer than necessary. Ready to enjoy their shared holiday break, Eddie nearly skipped down the stairs to the main floor with Cynthia close behind. On the way down the stairs, a loud thud startled them, followed by the sound of a door handle jiggling. The latter noise was the most disturbing, as it echoed eerily from upstairs. It was as if someone desperately wanted out of a locked laboratory. He jogged warily up the stairs to take a look. The noises stopped. Nothing seemed obviously out of place, but the air had become much colder, revealing his chilled breath's mist. As he walked to the lab they had just visited, he became aware of the peculiar sensation of being watched. It grew stronger until the tender hairs along the back of his neck sprang to life. The door was slightly ajar, and he assumed he had left it that way. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, turning on the light. Everything was as he left it, including the case. It sat upon the floor, closed and locked. However, the air felt charged and much colder. How'd this place turn into such a freaking icebox, and so quickly? "Ed?" Cynthia's worried voice echoed weirdly from the edge of the hallway near the stairs. "I'll be right there." His nervousness surprised him. Normally, he wasn't one to let weaker emotions govern his behavior, but his eyes also played tricks. As he turned off the lab's overhead lights and prepared to close the door, he could have sworn something moved toward him in the dimness, something darker than the deep shadows of the windowless room. An ink-like form reached him just as he pulled the door shut. For a moment, he simply stared at the closed door, expecting some other crazy shit to happen. There's no way in hell he'd venture inside the room a third time. He hurried to rejoin his fiancée at the end of the hall, casting several glances over his shoulder along the way. Anxious to leave, he led her out of the building in haste. Despite December's wintry chill outside, the air seemed warmer than it did on the second floor. They ran to his Mazda, jumped inside, and the car swerved out of the parking lot before either one had their seatbelts fastened. Eddie couldn't vouch for Cynthia, but that strange feeling of being watched by someone, or something unseen, stayed with him until the university's campus was no longer visible in the rearview mirror. There had to be a logical reason. Had to be. It's what he kept telling himself all the way to Miami Beach.